Now, if you're not using Configuration Manager today, if you're just coming from like Active Directory group policy for doing all your policy management, you might even be pushing software out. Though in those scenarios, you may not have some management solution, so you've never used Config Manager and you just started with Intune. We see a lot of customers because of the pandemic, they wanted to go to Intune because they needed to manage all these devices remotely. And so if you're on Config Manager today, or if you're on Intune, you don't have to have both. Although if you're on Config Manager, I would strongly recommend you start, adding Intune and going into co-management. But if you're starting from group policy, going directly to Intune, that's something that we see a lot of customers do today. And then within both of these solutions, you have various other products or services, like Windows Autopilot, which we're going to talk a lot about here in a minute, but also endpoint security, like Garrett mentioned, Defender for Endpoint. Managing Defender for Endpoint, the management of the devices is really all of that device management, all of the policies, the profiles that you're setting to your devices are all going to come from Intune. You can do that from Config Manager itself as well, but a lot of the work that we're putting into the management of those things is all going to come through Intune, as well as application management, and then using something like Endpoint Analytics to get additional information about your devices and how the devices are used in the environment. And so all of that really is encompassed into what this thing called Microsoft Endpoint Manager is. And so when you look at something like Intune and Config Manager, you really have, again, two separate products that are combined into this Microsoft Endpoint Manager solution. And what most might be used to is Config Manager on-prem today, where we've got our on-premises domain joined PCs, Windows 10, Windows 11. There was a Mac connector, not too many people used it. We've since deprecated it. We did have a Linux connector, not too many people used it. It's also since been deprecated. But all that stuff was just managed on-prem. Well, with Endpoint Manager and Intune, over the years, we've added the ability to do really two things. One is called tenant attach, and that's essentially taking your devices from on-premises and synchronizing all of those devices into the Endpoint Manager console, but not necessarily giving you the ability to manage them per se. You can see them in the console, but you won't actually see them. You're not pushing applications. You're not pushing policies to them. You're just seeing that data in one centralized location. But then there's co-management, and that's the number two that we have on the slide here. And what the co-management piece does is that's where we can take the workload of Configuration Manager and we can move that workload over to Intune. And so when you have a device that's co-managed, it's actually straddling that line between on-prem and the cloud. And so everything by default in that co-managed state starts with SCCM. And so that's where you push your applications, your settings, profiles, whatever you're doing in SCCM, all that stuff is still going to be controlled by SCCM initially. Then over time, you're going to start to move different workloads over to Intune. So you can decide that I want to move my Windows updates over to Intune. I want to move my endpoint protection policies over to Intune. And so over time, the goal is to really use this co-managed state as to be in this quote unquote hybrid state, but you're slowly moving everything over to Intune. And then once everything's moved to Intune, then we can get into this cloud native management piece where everything is managed by Intune. And then we can start to get away from SCCM if we no longer need it. So how do we do all of this, right? Like we've got to get the devices into Azure AD somehow, right? And so in order to do that, we need to understand the different identity states that we can be in. So by default, when you get a brand new device, given that we've just had a pandemic, given that we've had a lot of challenges with managing devices over the internet, a lot of customers want to just join the device to Azure AD because it's in the cloud and I can automatically enroll it to Intune once it's in Azure AD. And so it's an easier experience for that fresh, brand new device. But this isn't where we start, right? If you think about your current environment, you're starting from domain joined computers that might be managed by SCCM. They might not be. I talk to a lot of customers that don't have SCCM at all. And so they're using group policy. And that's the only thing they're using for managing devices. And so that state is what we would consider a hybrid state where the device is managed on the domain but then it's also registered to Azure AD. And so in both of these cases, these are corporate owned devices. You own them as an organization. They're flagged as corporate owned in Azure AD and in Intune. But this hybrid join device, it's technically a domain joined computer. It's a domain joined PC. And so the benefit to you is that I don't have to change my group policies. I don't have to change how I'm managing that device today. Even though I've hybrid joined it, I don't have to change anything. I can just keep it hybrid joined, and now I'm ready. I'm ready for COVID 2023, COVID 2024. We get some new variant of this, and we have to go back to having all these devices managed remotely. Or you're stuck in a hybrid state where everything's now just going to be kind of on-prems, got to have some stuff on the internet as well. You're going to be ready for the ability to manage these devices. So having your foot in both that on-prem and online world. And then lastly is the Azure AD registered state. And this is typically a bring your own device type of scenario. And you might notice in your tenant, if you go into your Azure AD portal and you look at all of your devices, you'll probably see hundreds, thousands of devices that say Azure AD registered. And the reason they do that is because when users use their devices and they want to get access to any work or school resources, they're signing in with their work or school account. And when they do that, it's going to ask them, do you want to register this device into your organization? They'll say yes, because they don't really know what it means to register the device into your organization. Now you start to see a ton of devices in your tenant that show up as Azure AD registered. Is that a big deal? Maybe, maybe not. In general, it's not, only because when you see those devices in there, it actually gives you the ability to leverage something called conditional access, where we can say, these devices that are trying to access my work or school data, they need to meet my conditional access policy. That's to be secure in order to get access to Office 365 and other resources. So by having these devices registered, you can actually control what they can get access to. If you didn't allow these things to be registered and people could just join or they can just grab whatever data, then you're not really securing the data in your environment. So a lot of customers want to turn off this registration of all these personally owned devices in their tenants because it shows a lot of machines that they don't want to manage. But at the same time, it also gives you that capability of securing the data that they're trying to access by looking at the device to see, is this device secure or not? So these are the three different states that your devices can be in. And you're going to start with that middle state. You're going to start with hybrid Azure AD join because all of your existing devices today are on your domain. But then you're going to buy brand new devices, and you're probably getting devices ready this summer that are brand new out of the box. And those devices, you've got a choice to make now. Do I want to make those hybrid Azure AD joined, just like everything else? Or do I want to start moving things to Azure AD? And that's the direction that we recommend customers go, is that if you've got brand new devices today, Azure AD join them. If you've got existing devices that are on your domain, the easiest way to get them into Intune is to hybrid Azure AD join them. And we'll talk here about how to do that. But before we do that, we need to really compare both Azure AD join and hybrid Azure AD join and when to use which when. So when we're looking at hybrid Azure AD join, we really think of this more as a transitory state. It's really to get your existing devices into cloud management, but it's not a state that we want you to be in forever. But you're going to probably have to be in this state for a little while because there might be resources that you need access to that require a domain computer object. And so if you have that need for a domain computer object to get you authentication or get access to resources via the computer auth, then you're going to kind of need to be in this state. The reason you need to be in this state is because when you Azure AD join a machine, there is no computer object from Azure AD that synchronizes down to your on-premises domain. And so because of that, things like your wireless networking, the way that you do radius auth, you might need a domain computer object in order to do that. And so if you don't have the ability to do wireless outside of domain computer, like computer authentication through radius, then you're going to be using hybrid Azure AD join. But most wireless providers do have some sort of alternative. So this isn't necessarily a hard blocker. I know we work with Aruba ClearPass, we work with Cisco, we work with a variety of different providers. I've got customers that have all these different providers, Meraki, and they all have different ways of doing wireless authentication. But a lot of customers that I talk to, their wireless authentication is generally just password-based. They're not using certificates. They're not using like EAP TLS to authenticate to the wireless network, which is a more secure way of doing it. And so, the wireless is one of those things that you really have to think about in determining, am I going to go Azure AD join or am I going to go hybrid Azure AD join? And then you could have legacy apps as well that might do domain computer authentication. It's more rare. I don't really see that too often. It's wireless that is usually the biggest consideration. And it's one thing that most people don't think about up front. They usually think about that later on down their pilot or their proof of concept is, at the very end, they're like, hey, great, we're going to go Azure AD join. Oh, wait, we didn't solve for wireless. And then so that usually kind of slows things down. So our long-term recommendation, as you probably can tell here, is that Azure AD join is what we would recommend everyone use. And with that, Azure AD join, users can do more common tasks. A lot of the things that we get pushback on from customers is, well, I need to get access to file shares. I need to get access to printers. I need to get to remote desktops. And you can get access to all of those things. All of us here that are on this call from Microsoft, like Garrett and Jody and Ryan and the others, we all are Azure AD joined. And we access file shares from home all the time. Like I've been in a home office here for, 12 years now. And I've had the ability in that entire time. Now, I was domain joined, I had a VPN for those earlier years, but probably in the last 5 years or so, everything's been Azure AD joined, and I still had access to all the things that I mentioned on this slide here. So these are not blockers to move off, to not do Azure AD join. The bigger blockers, like I said, wireless and other things that require that domain computer edge. And the other benefit here is that the user and the device can be managed from anywhere in the world. And since this pandemic, a lot of customers have moved from on-prem to Azure AD join because of the challenges with things like KMS. Devices after 180 days of the pandemic, devices were becoming not activated anymore because users couldn't hit KMS, and VPN was down, or you didn't have a VPN client on student machines. Or end user machines, or your VPN didn't have the capacity for all of these users suddenly to come into the organization. So Azure AD solves for a lot of these things. You still might have some instances where people have to VPN in, they've got large files, they've got some research projects and things like that you can't use cloud storage for, and I get it, there are going to be some scenarios there. But the vast majority of your users should be able to go Azure AD join. You're going to have some corner cases where you still might need to domain join some machines. But the biggest challenge, though, in this whole thing is, how do I get that domain join computer to Azure AD join? And that generally requires a reimage. I've seen some solutions in the community on MD or on Twitter where there are some people they're dropping machines off of they're disjoining from the domain. They've got some script that's running to save the user's data up to OneDrive, and they're doing a lot of these things to prevent the reimage of that box. But from a Microsoft perspective, we haven't provided any prescriptive guidance on how to migrate that domain joined computer to Azure AD join. Our recommendation is to reimage it. And the reason for that is to just keep the image clean. If you do these things where you're disjoining from the domain, one of the big problems with disjoining is that you can tattoo a lot of your group policy settings to the registry. And so we don't know exactly which policies, or at least I don't know, and I have never seen anything documented that says that these are the list of policies that tattoo to the registry, and they're stuck in the registry and they don't get removed. So that's one of the things I worry about with these customized solutions, is that if we have policies that are stuck in the registry and you're doing this custom thing, do we have a problem with that or not? And so that's why we recommend reimaging, because it's the cleanest way to do it, and we know that it's going to be more reliable. Just can't comment on some of the third-party stuff that might be out there. Okay, so I mentioned that middle scenario, that hybrid Azure AD join state, that existing device enrollment state. How do we handle this? How do we do this? So the first thing is that we need to configure hybrid Azure AD join via Azure AD Connect. and most of you might have already done this, but if for those that haven't, it's pretty simple to do. You just go through Azure AD Connect, make sure that that's installed. If you're using Office 365 today and you're synchronizing user accounts to use Office 365, you probably already have Azure AD Connect set up. You just need to set up the hybrid Azure AD join piece, which probably wasn't set up at the time that you set up AAD Connect. So to do this, just kind of follow these screenshots here. You need to configure device options once you open Azure AD Connect. Sign in with your credentials. Then under the device options, there's an option there to configure hybrid Azure AD join. And then you just select Windows 10 or later for the domain join devices. And then on the SCP configuration, the SCP is a service connection point. It's essentially just creating a configuration object within Active Directory that has your domain information, your domain name for your actual Azure AD domain, and it has your tenant ID. And it's creating this object. And so when your clients are turned on, your PCs are turned on, there's a scheduled task that runs when someone signs in that looks for this SCP. And so we're just looking in the domain to see if this SCP exists. And if it does, then we grab the domain information, the tenant ID, and then we do the enrollment into Azure AD. So there's a certificate that gets generated, and the device object gets synchronized up to Azure AD during the next Azure AD Connect sync cycle. And so this SCP is what we're configuring to do all that. And so once that's all configured, just hit the configure button, and over time you'll start to see devices show up in Azure AD. They'll show up as hybrid Azure AD joined, but they won't show up right away. Oftentimes we get questions from customers that says, "Hey, I set up hybrid Azure AD joined, but I'm seeing like 10 computers, and I set it up last Friday." And I came in on Monday and I expected to see all of my computers and I don't see anything. Why am I only seeing 10 out of like the hundreds I'm expecting to see? And the reason you're not seeing everything is because, like I just said, someone has to sign into that PC in order for this to happen, because there's a self-signed certificate that gets created when the user signs in that gets added to the domain computer object. And so if no one signs in and you're setting up hybrid Azure AD join for the first time to do that synchronization, it's not just synchronizing what's currently in that OU. It's actually waiting for the user to sign in to modify the object that's in that OU with that user certificate value. When we do that, then the devices start to show up in Azure AD. So it can take some time for things to show up, and especially if users don't sign out. Think about how a user uses a device, right? The user signs in, they use the device, and then they don't shut it down. They let it go to sleep. And so the laptop's asleep, and it doesn't reboot until patches install, usually. So it could be maybe a month before that machine actually reboots, and they're forced to sign in again. So if you're noticing that it's taking a long time for hybrid Azure AD join to actually show new devices, it's probably because your users haven't signed out and signed back in, or the device hasn't rebooted. So keep that in mind. Okay, so that's the first piece, to get the device into Azure AD. But now we need to get it into Intune. And so to get it into Intune, you've got a couple of ways of doing it. I'm going to talk about the way without SCCM first, and then I'm going to talk about the way with SCCM. And so without SCCM, actually in both cases, with or without SCCM, we need to make sure that in Intune, we have the ability for automatic enrollment for devices to actually enroll into Intune is set up first. And so you need to click on Enroll Devices. So you go into your Intune portal, go to endpoint.microsoft.com, go to the Devices tab, and then underneath Devices, there's this Enroll Devices option. Select that, and then select an automatic enrollment. And when you go into there, you're going to be on a screen that looks like this. And you can have MDM user scope set to some or all. We recommend all, because if you're using Autopilot or if you're using co-management, the devices, you're not gonna know which users are actually enrolling. At least not all the time. I mean, you can micromanage group memberships if you want, if you set this to some, but it's very difficult to do that. So in general, we just recommend setting this to all. Makes it really easy for you to get the devices in that you need. So make sure that's set to all. You can leave MDM user scope, or I'm sorry, you can leave the MAM user scope set to none, that's fine, but you want to make sure that MDM user scope is set to all. And then in group policy, and I hope you can see this on the slides, it might be, the screenshot might be a little tiny, but there's a group policy that you would set under computer configuration, under Windows components. There's an MDM node in there, and within MDM, there's an option to enable automatic MDM enrollment using default Azure AD credentials. And that option has there's a drop down here for something that says user credential. This is an older screenshot. If you look at a newer GPO, you'll see there's another option for like MDM application ID or something. That you don't have to fill the MDM application ID, and that's not necessary for this. All you need to make sure is that this is set to user credential, not device credential. And this is something we get a lot of customers coming to us saying, hey, my auto enrollment's not working. The device is in Azure AD. I see the hybrid join, but I don't see this in Intune. Why isn't it in Intune? Because you probably set this to device credential. Because logically speaking, you'd say, hey, I'm enrolling devices. I'm just going to select devices and it should work. But you actually need to set this to user credential. And once this is set to user credential, then the devices should start to enroll. So that's with the GPO method. Now, if you're using SCCM, this is actually pretty easy. Within SCCM, we still have to do what I talked about earlier with automatic enrollment into MDM. So you still do these steps. But where it changes is that in the SCCM console, you'll want to go to the administration node and go under Cloud Services. And under Cloud Services, there's an option here for Cloud Attach. This is new in the newer releases of SCCM, I think 2111. We started adding Cloud Attach. This used to be named a different node. But select Cloud Attach. And then, well, actually, I'm sorry. You actually click, when you're on Cloud Attach, right-click it and select Configure Cloud Attach, or you click the Configure Cloud Attach up at the top. Once you've configured that, you'll need to sign in to your Azure AD account. And then once you've signed in, then you'll specify whether you want to use the default settings for Cloud Attach or if you want to customize the settings. And when you select the default settings, this is going to enable automatic enrollment of all eligible devices for Intune. This is literally co-management. It's going to do co-management with this setting. But then it's also going to enable something called Endpoint Analytics. And I mentioned Endpoint Analytics earlier, and we might have just a separate deep dive into Endpoint Analytics. There's some really cool things we can do with it, and I just don't have enough time in this session to dig super deep into it. But it's something that I really wish I had when I was a customer a long time ago. That gives me a lot of insight into how fast devices are booting, devices that have blue screens, devices that are just having general problems that my users aren't sending to the help desk. They're not opening tickets. So I don't know that these problems exist. But with Endpoint Analytics, I can actually be a little bit more proactive. And I can take a look at those issues and say, I've got a bunch of machines that are blue screening, and it looks like it might be because my network driver. Let me go and deploy the latest network driver from my vendor, and maybe that'll solve the problem. So you can be more proactive in a lot of these things now with the data that we're providing. But then what we'll also do is we'll do automatic upload of all of our devices into Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So this is that tenant attach that I was talking about. So remember, the earlier slide, I had really tenant attach in that top left corner, and then I had in the middle section that co-management. Well, Cloud Attach is basically combining both of those into one now. So there aren't two different things; they're actually just one thing. And so now you'll start to see all the devices in the Microsoft Endpoint Manager console that are within your Intune environment. And so it's going to give you a prompt that says, hey, we're going to create an AAD application. This is really for authentication between both your cloud environment, your Azure AD environment, your Intune environment, and your SCCM environment. So it's going to ask you if you want to continue. So just select yes. And so that's basically how we get the enrollment done for existing devices. And again, that's where most people are going to start from. And so I got some resources here. I need to add one more here. I was about to do it before we started here, but I didn't have time to get it added. But I want to add also the link for co-management and how to set that up. But again, I just showed you in just screenshots. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, so talked about existing devices, but what about new devices? The new device scenarios are are pretty interesting. So we've got Autopilot, which a lot of you probably have already heard about. It's been around for a while now, and if you've talked to any of us before, we've probably presented to you ad nauseum about Autopilot. But if you don't know about Autopilot, it's kind of like Apple's, the old device enrollment program. Now it's the Apple device enrollment. And essentially, you just take the device that you buy the device from the OEM or your reseller, and they can enroll that device for you to Windows Autopilot. And once it's in Autopilot, you have the capabilities to deploy a profile to that device. So when your user signs in or turns the device on for the first time, they don't get prompted with privacy screens, and they don't get prompted with end user license agreements and things that you don't just want them to have to deal with. You want them to just sign into the device and have their applications and settings ready for them. And so Autopilot can help facilitate some of that stuff. But then there's also another tool called Windows Configuration Designer. And this isn't something that's quite as known as Autopilot is. You don't see a lot of marketing around Configuration Designer as you do with Autopilot. But a lot of folks on my team, me personally, actually prefer Configuration Designer over Autopilot in certain scenarios. And so with Configuration Designer, this basically allows us to create a package that can have applications and customizations and various things inside of it that can be added to the device during the out-of-box experience. So think of it kind of like Autopilot, but it's self-contained. It's local to the machine. And so imagine having to produce or provision, 1,000 devices or 10,000 devices or 100,000 devices. I'm in the middle of a 16,000 device deployment right now with a customer. And I've got a team of people that are on site right now in a warehouse that are using provisioning packages to reinstall Windows to the latest release. And then they're applying a provisioning package to enroll that device into Azure AD and to install a couple of apps and put also a few different settings on that machine. And we're not using Autopilot because we're doing 16,000 devices. Like if we had to download Office and we had to download a browser and a VPN client and a bunch of other apps, 16,000 times, that's a lot. And so in that scenario, it's a better use case to use Windows Configuration Designer over using Autopilot. And then lastly, the other tool that we have is something called Setup School PCs. And this is really more of an educator-driven or someone that's not really IT savvy. It's a wizard that you would walk through. It's actually a Windows Store app. So if you go to the store, do a search for Setup School PCs, that application, once you install it, it takes you through a wizard that is generally creating a provisioning package just like Windows Configuration Designer would do. But it's more teacher friendly, or someone just really not into any of this imaging stuff, that it's too confusing for them. Setup School PCs is a good alternative for them. And so we've got a customer base that uses all three of these tools in differing scenarios. And so going over Autopilot, with Autopilot, this is just a really high level overview here, but it's kind of what I described earlier, in that the hardware vendor, you're going to make a purchase to your hardware vendor, say, hey, I want 1,000 devices. And the vendor is going to be like, great. Do you want to roll them into Autopilot? And you're like, yeah, Richard told me all about Autopilot. So I want to enroll those things into Autopilot. They're like, okay, cool. So they enroll those into Autopilot. And those device IDs are all getting uploaded into the cloud. Now, Autopilot and Intune are actually two different services, but you manage them all in the same place. You manage them in the Intune portal. But technically speaking, they're actually two different services. So your vendor is going to enroll them into the Autopilot service. And then there's a synchronization process that's going to take place between the Autopilot cloud and the Intune cloud. And so the Autopilot cloud is going to synchronize the device objects over into Intune. You will see those objects in Intune at some point. You'll see just a bunch of serial numbers, makes and models of the devices, and you'll just have a long list of devices that you'll see. Now, you as the IT admin, you also have a pretty important role in all this, is that you've got to create a Windows Autopilot profile. And that profile is going to tell the device how to handle the out-of-box experience. It's going to say, skip the privacy screens, skip the EULA, skip all of these different things, make the user a standard user. You're going to create this profile. And that profile then will get synchronized over to the Autopilot service. And so when the employee gets that device, the employee is going to unbox it, or you can unbox it for the employee as well. It doesn't matter who unboxes it, but someone's going to unbox it. Once that device is unboxed, it joins the internet. So you get on wireless, jack it in with an Ethernet cable, whatever you want to do. Once that gets on the internet, it's going to automatically download an Autopilot profile. That profile is going to be what you created earlier that told the device how to handle UBI. And so once that happens, now we're going to get prompted to sign in with a user credential. Depending on the Autopilot profile you've selected, we might get prompted to sign in with our worker school account. And if we do, then Intune is going to start to deploy applications and settings, and everything's going to come down from the cloud. And so that's at a high level what the Autopilot service really is. But there are different scenarios with Autopilot. And there's about 5 different scenarios. Realistically, you probably are going to see 2 of these are used the most frequently. The first one is this user-driven mode with Azure AD Join. And this is the most common scenario that we have with Autopilot. And it effectively, what it's doing is it's just joining that device to Azure AD. And then it's going to enroll into Intune and download any applications and settings. And the user is going to sign in with their credentials, gets all their apps and settings, then they get to the desktop. And if you've seen any presentation on Autopilot before, and if I'm talking about something you already know about, you've probably seen this exact scenario. But the other scenarios aren't as common. User-driven mode with hybrid Azure AD Join. I've got a number of customers that are going through this right now, and it's painful. I don't recommend using it. It's something that there's a lot of moving parts to it, because effectively what this is doing is it's domain joining a computer to your on-premises domain. And it's doing it all through the out-of-box experience. And it uses this thing called an offline domain join blob. And it's just prone to a lot of mistakes if the environment is not set up correctly. And so we've just seen a lot of issues here with device objects not synchronizing, to trying to do this like over the internet with VPNs. And it's just a really messy, difficult configuration to set up. And so we just generally don't recommend it unless there's like some absolute, we need this, there's no way around this, that we have to have all of our devices domain joined. If that's the case, then you can go ahead and try this route, but just be warned that there are some configuration challenges that you can run into with it. The middle option here for self-deploying mode for Azure AD Join, this is really designed more so for the kiosks and shared device scenarios. So if you've got lab machines, which in education, we all have lab machines, whether you're K-12 or higher ed, this is a great option for those machines. There aren't any user credentials that are provided. So effectively what happens here is you take a device brand new out of the box, you plug it into Ethernet. It could go on wireless too, but generally speaking, if it's a lab machine, it's probably got Ethernet. So you're going to plug it into Ethernet, and the Autopilot profile will automatically download. And if it's set for self-deploying, then it's not even going to prompt you for credentials at all. It'll just immediately start to download your Intune applications and settings, and everything will come down. So great for shared devices. You can even use this for shared one-to-one device, or I'm sorry, shared laptop cart devices. So if you're in a K-12 space, laptop carts, this would also work for as well. Then we have Windows Autopilot for existing devices. This was primarily used for Windows 7 to Windows 10 migrations. You can still use it today, even on Windows 10. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. Effectively, what this is doing is it's taking a JSON file, it's just a text file, and it's copying it to a folder within Windows to tell the device at UBI to go through the Autopilot workflow. I've got some scenarios where I do use it, but it's not something that we generally see a lot of customers do, but it is there. And then lastly, we have Windows Autopilot pre-provisioning. And pre-provisioning is something that we used to call white glove. And effectively, the way this works is that you can unbox a device, and then instead of going through UBI, a technician, whether that's you or your partner or vendor, you can have them hit the Windows key 5 times. And what that'll do is it'll bring up a menu, and that menu will tell you, or it'll ask you, do you want to enroll with a provisioning package? do you want to enroll with Autopilot pre-provisioning? And so you'll select pre-provisioning. When you do that, the device will then go through and it'll install any applications or any settings that are targeted to the device. And it'll install all that stuff. When it's done, you as the technician or your vendor will then reseal that device. There'll be a button on the screen that says reseal. Click that button. It's going to sys-prep the device. Once it's done being sys-prepped, it can be boxed up, delivered to a user. The user could then turn the device on. Then they go through the user-driven mode with Azure AD Join, that option on the far left of the screen. The experience they get is going to be that kind of experience. The only difference is that they don't have to wait for applications and settings to come down, because that happened when the technician did it. So pre-provisioning can save you a ton of time. It's going to save the end user a ton of time. It won't save you a ton of time if you're the one that has to sit there and wait for the apps to come down. But you can get everything ready for the user. And so the user doesn't have to wait for Office to install. They don't have to wait for Global Protect or some other VPN client or some content filter. All that stuff can be done by you ahead of time. And so you just have to, go through and wait for all that stuff to install. And so that's Autopilot. I don't have time for demos in here, so unfortunately we won't be able to dig into those. But what I do want to talk more about here is provisioning packages. So with provisioning packages, as I mentioned earlier, these are basically local self-contained packages. I kind of think of them like if you use MDT or SCCM with a task sequence, I think of these like a poor man's task sequence. It's a task sequence that, or it's not a task sequence, but it's a package that I can install things or I can do things in a specific order. So I can say that I want like an application to install, and then I got a second app that I want to install, I got a third app I want to install, and I could put these in order. Or I might have a script that I want to run, and then an app to install, and then maybe another script to run, and then an app to install. I can do this just like a task sequence, as opposed to having to use MDT or to use SCCM. And it's all self-contained on a USB drive. So this USB drive is kind of magical, right? It's got the ability to join the device to Azure AD. It's got the ability to add applications. It can add settings. And I can do this on an unlimited number of devices. It's not just one device. If I'm doing a large scale rollout of a school district with 60,000 devices, I can do it all through provisioning. And I can have all my apps and I can have everything all in that package. And it's fast. It's a lot faster than Autopilot, because remember, with Autopilot, I got to wait for everything to download. And so if I'm doing a ton of devices, I can saturate my network. If I have one AP that's in my warehouse, I wasn't really scaled out for a 60,000 device rollout. Autopilot's going to be pretty difficult in that kind of environment. Let's see here. Can't demo this right now. I've only got 4 minutes left here. We can actually have a deeper dive conversation. Actually, what I want to do is actually have a deeper dive conversation on provisioning packages, because there's some really interesting and unique things that we do with them that actually help out for large scale deployments, whether that's hundreds or thousands of devices. But how we choose between the two of these things. So Autopilot is something that works well, I personally think, in one-to-one deployments. If you're doing faculty and staff members and you've got an order that comes in for maybe 10 devices, you got 10 different teachers or 10 different faculty members, Autopilot, I think, works well in that scenario, because you can give the device to the end user and you can just give them some instructions on, like, hey, this is the experience to expect. You're gonna have to wait for your apps to download and all that stuff. Like, you can tell them and they can be patient. But if you're doing a lot of devices at once, like you're doing hundreds or thousands of them, Autopilot can be a challenge in those scenarios. And so for Autopilot one-to-one deployments, devices shipped directly to the user. They can go to IT as well, but generally speaking, if the user is the first person to sign in, they become the primary user of that device. And so if you as the IT admin goes through Autopilot for them, and you sign in with your credentials, you become the primary user. And that creates problems with things like getting BitLocker recovery keys. It creates problems with the company portal application and doing self-service installations of applications, because they're not the primary user, you are. And so you generally end up with some weird scenarios in that case. So if you're going to do Autopilot, generally speaking, have the person that's going to sign into that's going to use that device, have that person sign in first, because they're the primary user, and then all these other things work the way we expect them to. But going back into provisioning packages, what they work well for, shared device scenarios. With school devices, a lot of our devices are shared. Maybe not as much after the pandemic, because a lot of us got a ton of funding, and so one-to-one is kind of where we ended up. But prior to the pandemic, a lot of schools were shared laptop carts, and it was tough. So with shared devices, provisioning packages have just worked well in general, but it also works well in one-to-one as well. The second option, or the second line item here, is devices shipped to a warehouse and delivered to schools. I don't know how many of you guys ship everything to your warehouse, but I have a lot of customers that do these large device deployments that everything goes to their warehouse. And with Autopilot, the challenge that we have with that is, if I'm buying 10,000 devices and I need to divide all of them up into different groups of devices for different schools, with Autopilot, I use this thing called group tag. And I can tell my vendor, hey, for these 1,000 devices, give it group tag ABC. For these 1,000 devices, give me group tag DEF, so on and so forth. And when I get all these devices shipped to one central location and they're all brown boxes, I have no idea which brown box goes to which school. So I can't even tell I have to go find serial numbers and then go into the Intune portal and search what the group tag is for that device to know which group it belongs to. So when you're doing these massive deployments, you've got logistical challenges that you run into with Autopilot sometimes. Low bandwidth scenarios, that's great for provisioning packages. I do some work with India, and those guys over in India, they've got rural networks. Bandwidth is very, very challenging. And so in those scenarios, we see that they need a solution like a provisioning package. They need Office, they need Chrome, they need all the browsers, they need everything on this package. They can't use Autopilot because they just have zero bandwidth to download all that stuff. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, large scale deployments, provisioning packages work well there. I've just got a couple more slides here, then we'll wrap up. I know we're just going to be slightly over here, so sorry about that. This is just a picture of a warehouse that I was working in probably about 4 years ago. All the brown boxes you can see way in the back, those are all the devices that we have to provision. And so we were just basically taking devices one after the other out of the box and putting a USB drive in to install the provisioning package. And so this is probably very similar for a lot of you guys. Every summer, you might do work exactly like this. And so we were just churning out devices left and right, and just making sure that they all provisioned successfully. So that's what the process looks like with provisioning. I'll share the deck in the team later on after this after the call. But considerations, I mentioned the primary user problems, so I'm not gonna rehash all of these here. But you do have some scenarios where, depending on who signs in first, they're going to be a primary user or not. And so these are just some things to think about. And I think with that should be it for the deck. I see there's some questions in the chat. Let's see, can we send a doc on provisioning packages? Yeah, Ryan's got a doc there. Laura, I'm going to have a separate session, I think, on some more of the more nuanced things that you can do with a provisioning package, like applications that have multiple folders and files. That could be a challenge, especially something like Office, where it's really just has 2 files to it, right? It's got a setup file and there's an XML file. Well, putting that into a provisioning package is actually, by default, is hard to do. You can't just pass 2 files to it. You got to do it in a specific way. So there's some things there that we can kind of talk more about. It's going to take probably another 30 minutes to kind of go through the different unique things that we do with customers with them. But with that, thanks everyone for your time. I know we're a couple minutes over. Thanks for staying, for those that are here. We'll make sure to get the recording of this up into the team, and then I will post this deck there as well. And then we'll kind of go from there. I know we've got another meeting here in 2 weeks, so we'll look forward to seeing you guys all then. Thanks a lot, everyone. Take care and have a good rest of your week. Thanks, Kelly. All right, so Tim here, when would you prefer a pure provisioning package? Per provisioning package layering task sequence when you can also just create a thick image and deploy that, especially if it's the same model versus thick image based on provisioning package. So about like drivers. Yeah. Yeah, Tim, that's a great question. I don't know if you're still listening here, but
yeah, still here.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it depends on the customer. So like we do a lot of work with New York, and they're they're the biggest in the country. And one deployment we're doing right now is actually we do have a thick image that we're using for their apps, but we still need to use the provisioning package for enrollment. So we would put like Office into the image. We'll put all the apps in, and then we'll just go. And we'll use that image just for that deployment. So the goal isn't to use that image forever. It's to just use it for that particular deployment because we're doing like 60,000 devices. But if once you get through the initial deployment, then it's like, okay, now what should I do? Should I do Autopilot? Should I do provisioning? And that really depends on kind of how your devices come in. Like if you're doing like a single device at a time, Autopilot probably works fine. If you're doing dozens or hundreds, then maybe you still just use provisioning. You still use a thick image. But it's not like a one-size-fits-all thing. But just for these really large deployments, yeah, thick images, because anything that can save us any amount of time, if it's a minute, if it's 30 seconds, you multiply that by 60,000, it adds up. And so we're just trying to save as much time as possible. So a thick image does have its use cases, in certain scenarios.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, guys. Well, take care. Have a good rest of your week.